So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Hanstead. He was for the P&W task force. He was one of our mentors that we actually invited him to meet with us because we were so impressed with his presentations and also his work in general education. So first, I do have to say he is one of our fellow travelers in the humanities as another humanist. He started his career as a professor of Victorian literature, but then he moved on to other things too, such as he is now the founding director of the Center for Academic Resources and Pedagogical Excellence at Washington and Lee University. He's a leading expert on general education and pedagogical reform and has worked both in the United States and Asia, as well as in Europe and Africa. He is a recipient of several teaching awards, including the 2013 State Council for Higher Education in Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award and the 2014 Case Carnegie Virginia Professor of the Year Award. He has authored many works, articles, scholarly articles, short stories, as well as several books on general education, including General Education Essentials and Creating Wicked Students. He also appears regularly in Liberal Education, Faculty Focus, and Inside Higher Education. So Paul, we're thrilled to have you here, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good. Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I will just reinforce what Elaine said about chat and raised hand function, and alert you all to the fact that I am a notorious monotasker. So I won't pay attention to those at all, but I know Elaine will bring them to my attention. So please do feel free to use them. I'm going to share the screen and get things going. Okay, everybody able to see okay? All right. Purpose of the talk, I think, is the conversation seems to be going along a pace in terms of the general education possibilities of reform there. So I see my job is just kind of coming in and talking a little bit about the bigger picture. It's always very easy for all of us, you know, where our lives are so busy, especially now when we've got added layers of pressure on us. To kind of reinforce and clarify and answer some questions and put some ideas out there, and maybe to a bit of an extent to bend your thinking just a little bit more, to maybe expand your sense of what may be possible and why it may be possible. I think that we are living in a complex and very messy world that requires us to think beyond the assumptions, to move beyond the assumptions that we may bring to the table normally. So I will do some of that. I'm going to begin by talking about the trends. If you take all of the general education models in the world, and it is now a worldwide phenomenon, back in 2012, AAC&U had the first ever general education conference in Asia. They expected 50 schools to show up. 350 showed up. So this is expanding. There are general education and liberal arts programs increasingly in Europe. So if you take all of these models and put them on a continuum, what you're going to find on the left-hand side is going to look very familiar. It's your basic distribution model. 2 of this, 2 of that, 2 of the other, maybe some additions, some writing, maybe there's some wiggle room where they say either 2 math and 1 natural science, or 2 natural science and 1 math, but it, you know, generally a pretty familiar model. On the other side, what we have are more integrative models. And what we mean by integrative, I like to explain it by pointing to interdisciplinary and integrative, and they're side by side, and making a distinction. I think of, for instance, an interdisciplinary course is a course where they take 2 things that are maybe connected, but we don't generally think of them together, and you put them together into the same course. That would be an interdisciplinary course. So you could have politics and art. And certainly there are connections between the 2. And certainly you're going to find people with degrees in political science who study art, how art influences politics and how politics influences art, and people in the arts who study the politics of art. But for the vast majority of faculty in those two departments, they're going to feel like a little bit of an artificial connection. Integrative, on the other hand, I like to think of this way. Elaine mentioned that I have a PhD in Victorian literature. Every time I teach Victorian literature, I must talk, obviously, about history, but I also must talk about religion and science, because that was Darwin. And I have to talk about gender because the Seneca Falls Convention is in 1848, and that changes the conversation. I have to also think about politics because of the expanding vote. I have to think about education because of expanding schooling. I have to think about the Industrial Revolution. So point being, within my field, there are all these parts of other fields. And in my mind, an integrative course, when I teach Victorian literature, I'm simply mentioning those things. For me, though, in an integrative course, what I'm doing is I'm foregrounding the connections. Rather than just saying, here's Victorian literature, and here are some pieces you need to know, I'll say, here's Victorian literature, here are some ways you can connect to this. Here are some things you need to know. Here are some things you might take away. What can you learn from Victorian literature that you can take back to the sciences? So here's another way to think about this. Gen Ed, the traditional model, is simply, there's this, there's this, there's this. We want you to have all of them, because being well-rounded is a key goal. And of course, everybody wakes up in the morning and says, what do I want? I want to be more well-rounded. No, I don't mean to dismiss that, but point is, it's not a particularly motivating way to think about it. And it seems slightly artificial, because there is something slightly artificial about it, at least the way we talk about it so far. An integrative model, on the other hand, Gen Ed 2.0, says, yes, here's science, here's social science, here's arts and humanities. We want you to understand the arts and humanities. We want you to understand the social sciences. We want you to understand the sciences. But we also want you to think very deliberately about how they connect and how they don't connect, where they overlap, where they don't overlap, how they're distinct. And to think a lot about, if I'm an English major and I'm required to take physics, what do I take away from that? And how does that apply to English? But beyond that, how does it apply to the world I'm living in, the media, to my career goals, to where I want to go, to my family life, to political life, to spiritual life, and the other way around. If I'm a physics major and I'm required to take a poetry class, what on earth do these two have to do with each other? And what do I gain by thinking about what poetry is trying to do and how that relates to what science is trying to do? So Gen Ed 2.0 moves beyond simply, here are the disciplines. It says, here are the disciplines, how do they relate to one another? And then how do they relate to the world more directly? And again, there's that idea of foregrounding. It's not just, here's a material, by the way it's connected, but really pushing that, asking students to think very deliberately about how these fields and these questions within the fields relate to one another. In my mind, this moves beyond the title of general education. General education implies general, breadth, vague. I like to instead push the term liberal education. And of course, that grows out of liberal arts. And I like the original Latin for liberal arts, which is artis liberalis, which means, when you translate it, the arts by which a person is free. And so this idea that if we're going to be truly free when we move into the world, we want to not just have our field, and our field is very important. We learn a lot from that, including gaining expertise, which develops the brain. Our field is very important, but these other fields are important as well, but not just being exposed to those fields, but being familiar with those fields, being familiar with thinking about how they compare and contrast, about taking ideas in one area and attempting to apply them in another, okay? That's a general overview of the trends. Let me mention this as well. We also know, and I believe this data is from 2015, actually it could be from 2018, it is from 2018, that if you look at the models being used, roughly 15% fall into the purely distributional model. Roughly 18% fall into the purely integrative model. and roughly 64% blend the two. In addition, though, we know that the trend is moving this way, from pure distribution to more integrative, not necessarily pure integrative, but more integrative models. And that's the trend. And what I want to explore next is why that is happening. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the rationales. I'm going to give you 5. Here's what you need to know about the 5 that I'm going to give you. These are not the same 5 that I gave a year and a half ago. These are not the same 6 or 4 that I mentioned in my book that I wrote in 2012. These are not the same 4 or 7 that Paul Gaston uses. He's emeritus from, I want to say, Notre Dame, although I might not have that right, that Paul Gaston talks about when he talks about the rationales. There are different rationales, different ways of thinking. These are the 5 that are pressing to me right now. Why are we moving towards more integrative models? Why are we moving beyond models that simply say, here's the fields, here's the content, that's all you need to know? Okay, so I'm going to talk about these 5 in a little bit of depth. First, it's a wicked world. I first encountered the term wicked problems in 2010 when I was in Hong Kong doing a Fulbright on general education. I met an engineering professor named Edmund Coe. He's since passed away. And he was Stanford educated. He taught at Carnegie Mellon for a long time. And when I met him, he was at the University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong. And he talked about this concept of the wicked problem. Now, engineering actually stole this concept from city planners. The first article and the first use of the term came up in in the 1970s, where city planners were pointing to the education that happened in the classroom, and then how when students moved into the world beyond the classroom, there was a level of complexity that they hadn't encountered before. And engineers looked at this terminology and said, that's exactly what we're facing. We are facing situations more often as not, where the dynamics and the parameters are constantly shifting. They're in flux, they're moving. What it looks like this week and what it looks like next week are completely different. We're encountering situations that are resistant to previous solutions. I use the example, and Elaine's heard me use this now 3 times in the last 24 hours. In Chicago, when they decided they wanted to build skyscrapers in the 1880s and 1890s, they wanted to be like New York. They wanted to prove themselves as being a substantial American city. They dug down and they had a problem because there was no bedrock. So what do you do? Previous solutions aren't going to work. Sometimes the data is incomplete. Sometimes the data is contradictory. I think, for instance, about the Gulf Horizon explosion that happened about 10 years ago, where it took a long time just to figure out what was going on. And what British Petroleum was telling us and what the people on the ground was telling us didn't necessarily add up. We couldn't even really see what was going on. And in the meantime, it's a crisis. It has to be solved. And I think that's another aspect of the wicked problem. It's not something we can just ignore. In addition, sometimes the problems themselves are difficult to recognize. In my next slide, I'll mention politics. The concept of fake news, I don't know about anybody else here, but I never heard that term until November 10th, 2016. So it was happening, but we didn't even know that it was happening. And then finally, I'll make this point. Oftentimes for wicked problems, the solutions are going to draw from multiple areas. They're not going to come from a single formula that exists over here, because oftentimes, as number 2 points out, previous solutions aren't going to work. All right, so some examples. COVID. In fact, I used to, when I was introducing wicked problems, I have 10 more examples I could use. I'm going to use 5 here today. COVID is a perfect example of a wicked problem. When it came up, we didn't know how infectious it was necessarily. We didn't know necessarily how to stop it. We didn't know how it related, how bad it was going to be. In addition, it's a wicked problem because it engages politics, it engages communication, religion plays a role in it. So solving a COVID is going to take good science, but it's pretty clear right now that good science isn't enough in the political realities that we live in. So COVID's a good example, or a bad example, of a wicked problem. Racial injustice is another one. It seems pretty obvious when somebody kneels on somebody else's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until they die, that that is a bad thing and we should solve it. But somehow, again, in the political realities that we're living in, it's complex. And there's so much going on here. That's politics, sociology, economics, unions come into play. Obviously, race comes into play, identity comes into play, language and communication and the arts come into play. Climate change, another example. Immigration, another example. These are things that you look at and go, well, the solution is obvious, but somehow we can't get there because there's complexities that come into play. Politics, I've already mentioned that. And then education. And I know education seems like a weird one because the previous 5 are clearly issues, challenges, and education we see as a solution. But think about it on a macro level. You're talking about gen ed revisions. What kind of gen ed revision is good for your institution? Is it the same as a gen ed revision at Harvard? No, probably not. Is it a simple solution? Probably not. Is it a solution that everyone's going to agree upon? Probably not. You've got pressures from your departments, you've got pressures from the state government, you've got pressures from administration and outside the accreditation and agencies and all of that stuff. So on a macro level, education is complicated. You can even think about that in secondary school with magnet schools and funding for private schools and all those kinds of things coming into play. How much testing is or isn't valuable. But even think about it on a micro level. I have a integrative gen ed course called Artistic and Literary Responses to Science and Technology. So it's an art and poetry and literature course designed for students in STEM. And I can teach that course at 9 o'clock and nail it. I mean, it'll be brilliant. And I can teach that same exact class at 10:30 and it'll bomb. The community of the classroom is a wicked problem. The dynamics of the classroom are complicated and shifting, and you never know what you're going to see, what's going to happen. Maybe that one student who always talks and always gets the conversation going is absent for a day. Or maybe that couple at the front of the room that always energizes people, they've broken up and now they're not talking to each other. And none of these things are in our control. Okay. So a few questions thinking about wicked problems and how they relate to general education reform. One of them, given the ideas that are coming forward at PNW, how similar is the big problems proposal idea to this concept of wicked problems? And to me, it sounds actually fairly similar, and an interesting way to think about things. And I love the fact that for the students, it seemed like they recognized that it was important. Are there ways that we can leverage the concept of big and wicked problems to shift how students think about education? Oftentimes with tame education, students think about it as, you're the teacher, tell me, and then I'll have everything I need. And then they go beyond college and they realize that they don't have everything that they need, that there's more to it. That education not only requires them to take in, but to start to produce, to put out, to think for ideas, and to think about the next step within a field. How can we leverage big wicked problems to increase constructive dialogues across departments and divisions? I mean, one thing about getting an advanced degree is we tend to start falling into silos and clustering around our departments and the thinking within our departments. If our students are going to move into a world that doesn't recognize or respect the divisions that we've created in the academic institution, how can we use this idea of big wicked problems to have better conversations across fields and think about how that deepens sort of cultural values and understanding and a shared sense of purpose within the institution, which is going to be only beneficial to the institution, by the way. Second area I want to focus on, why do we move towards a more integrative approach? It's the workplace. So this is how students envision their careers, oftentimes. Here's what a job really looks like, okay? Because the students don't always get the jobs that they want. And sometimes they don't even go into the fields that they study. At my previous institution, and I've apologized for constantly referencing them, but I've only been at my new institution for 15 months. So my mind is still, after 23 years, so my mind is still kind of focused. We use a statistic of about 40, 45% would study X and then go into X. So sometimes by the time they finish their degree, they already know, I like this, but it's not really where I want to go. I'm still young. I've got other paths I want to explore. And of course, we know that they don't stay in the field that they start in. The statistic I've heard from teaching is that within the first 3 years, you have something close to 50% attrition. We know this, people's lives, people's careers, people's goals, who they want to be, how they want to add to the world, that changes, which is a good thing, right? Because if you're thinking at 42 exactly the way you did at 22, something's probably not happening. And of course, they don't necessarily stay in the positions they started in, even if they go into the fields they study and they stay in that field. So I use the example oftentimes of my friend Kurt, who is an architect, went to the University of Tennessee, which is a very good architecture program, and got hired by a lovely firm in Charlottesville. And for the first 3 years, he was mainly working with, developing plans and everything. But then he got promoted, and suddenly his job was to meet with the client. And then he got promoted again, and suddenly his job was to go to the city council meetings and the city planning meetings. And then he got promoted again and became a partner. And suddenly he was in charge of long-term goal thinking for the firm, also thinking about human resources, thinking about the business end of things, none of which he was prepared for necessarily in his architecture program. So if we're producing successful students, their jobs are going to evolve, they're going to shift. And of course, even before he left, plan drawing, the skill he learned in college working with blueprints didn't even exist anymore. All the blueprint work was being done on a computer. So there's constantly new technology coming into place in the workplace, new challenges coming into play in the workplace. And we need to prepare students to respond to those. And if you think about the integrative model, where they're not just moving from field to field, but they're thinking about what it's like to move from field to field, that prepares them for walking into a job, seeing a problem that they've never seen before, and thinking about that. Being more deliberative about it, being more reflective about it, knowing how to respond when they see a challenge that they've never encountered before. Final point I'll make about the dynamics of the workplace is, of course, and I mentioned this, I guess, just now, we tend to divide the institution into these divisions, these fields, these departments. Worth noting, this is a construct that's really only existed for about 150 years. Before that, everybody studied philosophy, and philosophy included chemistry, mathematics, logic, philosophy, but it also included culture and the arts. The workplace isn't divided like this. My father was a Lutheran minister in a small town in Wisconsin, and he studied theology, he studied Greek and Latin, and he spent half his time managing budgets, managing personnel, doing counseling, and all of them were pastoral work, but they didn't draw from that theology degree. And so an integrative model recognizes the ways that things blur together, which replicates more accurately what life is like beyond college. A few things to think about as we think about the role of the workplace. How can we begin to nudge students to move beyond the direct path vision of work into recognizing the complexities? Are there assignments we can give them? Are there case studies we can give them? Are there things we can bring up in class discussion? Ways we can structure our courses more generally, or our curriculum as a whole? If finally we're trying to prepare them for the world beyond college and to succeed and thrive in that world, what can we do at the educational level that is less focused on the models that they're getting from secondary school and more focused on what life is like after college? Third rationale, a meaningful education. And I will point out, I know how to spell meaningful. I did this deliberately. I wanted to remind people of the idea that meaningful actually comes from full of meaning. And you'll understand hopefully why as I move on to this next slide. This comes from the Hong Kong Institution of Education, now the University of Education in Hong Kong. And the caption, it's an image that they used to have in the halls on their campus. And the caption that was below it is "My Teacher." And obviously it's a tree, but obviously it's a tree that's made up of a dozen different things. And I just love this image because it makes the point that to be a teacher is to draw from many different pieces and parts of who you are and of your experiences and of your education. We've got the calculator, we've got the computer, we've got the music. I think the thing right in the middle on the left-hand side, I think that's a martini glass. I'm not sure how that got in there, but I think I understand how that might fit into the life of a teacher these days. So the point is that all of our students finally need to take all these pieces, their majors, their minors, their exploratory classes, the clubs they belong to, their jobs on campus, their jobs off campus, their home life, not to mention all these different fields. And finally, they need an opportunity to put them all together into something meaningful, into something that makes sense for them. If they're going to have agency when they leave college, they need to not just be the recipients of all these pieces, they need to be able to create and construct something and have a sense of who they are. And the question really is, where does this happen? Where do we have time, or where do we build this into our curriculum? My friend Rich, who's a physicist, he makes the point that students come to college with a box full of puzzle pieces that draws from their high school education and their parents and their friends and the clubs and the stuff they've read on all these pieces. And they want to make sense of these pieces. They want a job, but they also want sense. They want purposefulness. And what do we do in college? We just put more puzzle pieces in the box. Where do we allow them to put those pieces together? So this crucial question, where do your students have the opportunity to do this? In our courses, at the assignment level, at the discussion level, in the course goals, in advising, I didn't put that here, in the curriculum as a whole. And let me give you an example of this. Just last week, I'm working with the Vermont State Colleges, and talked to Castleton University last week and came across a really interesting model, their new Gen Ed model, which I just voted on earlier this month. It has all the normal pieces that we kind of expect. It has, first year writing and aesthetics and humanities, and all those things are there. Not particularly striking, but what is striking about it is what they've done through the middle of all of that. So it's a basic distribution model, but then they built this kind of column that goes down the middle that allows students to pull these pieces together. It begins with a first year seminar, which introduces students to the complexities and the challenges and the codes of academic life, to ideas like resilience and grit, and the ways in which, messing up on something and getting it wrong might actually help lead you someplace else. And they begin establishing an e-portfolio at the beginning of that first year, where they're kind of constructing and thinking about who they are coming into college and who they might want to be moving through. Then somewhere in the sophomore or junior year, this is Critical Connections course. It's actually for them a reading-based course to emphasize deeper collegiate level reading, but it's drawing readings for every course from all sorts of different fields. So again, it's integrative, it's pulling from different areas, dealing with a particular question. And the e-portfolio again comes into place there. And then the senior year, they have a culminating connections course, which can be anywhere from 1 to 3 credits, and it can be as small as a large project that sort of signature work that the student does, or maybe there's a course connected to it. But again, it's pulling pieces together and it's assembling a professional portfolio that can be outward looking towards sort of searching for a job. And we have data that shows that about 80% of employers, given the opportunity, would actually like to see a professional portfolio, because I think it gives them a better sense of not just the qualifications of the candidate, but the personality of the candidate. And we know that that plays a part in hiring. There is a connection. I'm going to come back to this. There's a connection to this next area of inclusion. And remember how I said that these change. Elaine talked about how they first encountered me at the AAC&U meeting in early June. Because that meeting was virtual, we had to, we flipped it. So we did half of our presentations in video form, and then we did live synchronous workshops in early June. So in early May, I made my initial slides for this similar presentation, and inclusion was not in it. In early June, inclusion was in it because George Floyd had been murdered. And I'm foregrounding this because I want us to remember about that we need to be responsive, that education and the models we use need to change. Your model, I think, is 15 years old. Nothing wrong with that. That happens. Very good models can be like that. But it is worth noting that, 5 years ago, the world we lived in 2015 and the world we live in 2020 are very different worlds. The world we lived in 2005 didn't even have smartphones. So anyhow, moving on to inclusion. I use this image again because I just really like it, how some students experience education. It's a straight path, I was not a first generation student. My father did his BA, and then he got a theology degree, and then he went and he got a doctorate of ministry. So I moved into higher education with a clear sense of how it's supposed to work. And my father and my mother had both gone to liberal arts schools, so that it was a path for me. It made sense to me. It was built into who I was. And the same thing is true for my kids. My son is going to Grinnell College in Iowa. What a surprise that the son of a man who studies and works with general education ends up at a small liberal arts college. For some of our students, it is a straight path. They come in, they know the codes, they understand the moves, they understand why they're being asked to do X, Y, and Z. For other students, it's like this. Not only are they not sure about what's immediately in front of them because maybe they didn't come from that background, maybe they are a first generation student, maybe their parents or their culture or their friends didn't necessarily value the thoughts of higher education. Not only immediately in front of them, but even beyond that, you notice that the road curves here. So, and again, think about COVID. We've been on this long bending road for 8 months now. Also, this is what higher education can look like to them. So I think where I'm going for inclusion is that we need to think about how we can help students crack the codes of university life and learning, both early on, and I know the models that are being proposed have first-year experience components to them, but also throughout, because the confusion is college early on, but then as we move through college, is thinking about professionally what's going to be expected of me, which is another reason why those two road things, using that image of the straight road makes sense twice, because sometimes how they view everything is a straight path, and really it's a more complicated path than that. And the thing about an integrative model, for years and years and years when I taught Victorian literature or when I taught first year writing, I taught it on the models that I inherited, and that made sense to me as an academic. And I didn't really have to be particularly deliberative about it. I just did what I'd been taught, and it worked well for me, so why wouldn't it work well for everybody else? Well, because I'm not everybody else. One, white, straight male, but also, I'm that 1% of the population that goes into higher ed. What I value is not necessarily the experience and the values of the students that I'm working with. So an integrative model pushes us to get out of our grooves, to get out of our comfort zones, to stop thinking about our fields just as content delivery and move beyond that and be more deliberative about how we approach education and how we're working with our students, which means being more inclusive. And again, I would just kind of point to the Castleton University model, because it is deliberate at the first year, throughout, and then at the end. I'll also point to this, though, because e-portfolios are what is known as a high impact practice. George Koo took some NESI data, looked at about 20,000 students, and determined that if we want students to be able to respond to complex problems, problem solving, communication, critical thinking, there were 11 things that if they encountered them in college, the more they encountered them, the better off they were at those things when they left college. Actually, there were 10 at the time, and then he added e-portfolios. They are right there in front of you. You can obviously look up high impact practices and Kuh, K-U-H, to read a little bit more about it. Here's a point I kind of want to make. We know from the data that high impact practices benefit people, But what I want to point to here is that they disproportionately benefit. The lower the GPA, the more helpful they are. That's that green line at the bottom, if you look at the angle. In addition, thinking about GPA in terms of race and ethnicity, we know that they disproportionately aid underrepresented minorities when they come into college. When the more of these high impact practices they encounter, the more they benefit. Same thing is true for African American students in terms of retention and continuing returning to education. So these high impact practices not only help, but they really particularly help those who are underrepresented and that traditional educational models might not be as effective for. I will also point this out, that the models that are being presented at PNW, they have first-year experience in them. That's great. They have writing intensive courses, at least one, but maybe two, I can't remember. And they're kind of built around a learning community model where everybody in that community is focusing sort of on the same topics. And that's really good and integrative because they're comparing how does mathematics approach big problems versus how do the humanities approach big problems versus how does communication deal with big problems. But there's room here. There's other areas that can be approached. What about e-portfolios? What about a capstone course at the end of each of the clusters? Even something as simple as collaborative projects. The more students work with other students, the better they become at the wicked problem of collaboration, but also the more they learn about other perspectives and different ways to solve problems. So collaborative projects are a high impact practice. We also have data from employer surveys that they like to hire people who are comfortable working with people with other viewpoints. And then there's something more impactful or more that has higher requirements like community-based learning, for instance. Last area is social justice. And I think, again, this is one that I've added even since the early part of the summer. Finally, regardless of career, regardless of if a student is pre-professional or working in a fine arts course or in the humanities or in philosophy or whatever field, when we think about social justice, when we think about inclusion, finally, where are our students exploring, and not just once, but repeatedly, ethics, viewpoints that are different from their own, information literacy, where are they getting their information? Have they learned how to evaluate good information from bad information? I've got a very, very, very good friend who thinks a YouTube video is a qualified source. Hard to have that conversation, and I think it hurts him to have that belief. Problem solving, and not just the problem solving within the field, but problem solving that moves beyond the field, those problems that they haven't seen before, and those mediations that need to occur with those problems. Truly effective listening and communication. We talk a lot about leadership, but listening is part of leadership. Where do they learn to do that? Where do they learn to really take in other viewpoints, consider other challenges and other ways of looking at the world, which will help them with problem solving? Empathy, humility, and you've heard me use this word a lot, deliberateness, deliberation. We know, think about doctors. We know that doctors tend to prescribe painkillers more and in greater quantities to white patients, even though pain for everybody is exactly the same. We also know that if you put a prompt in the computer where they enter a painkiller and a prompt comes up and says, remember, painkillers are disproportionately underprescribed to patients of color. Please be aware of that and attend to it in how much you prescribe. If we put that prompt in there, that nudge in there, it causes people to be more deliberate. Where are we building that into our curriculum to approach the world deliberately and thoughtfully and in a just manner? Okay. A few key ideas. I put this in my PowerPoint when I talk to any campus. One, that GE spread over 4 years will lead to a greater learning and a better chance of integrating these values throughout life. Integrative thinking is not simple. It requires synthesis, it's complexity, it's moving beyond basic information reception and complex forms of application. That takes time to learn. That in mind, very few of the complex skills that we're talking about can be taught in a single course. They're going to be repeated. So maybe think about ways that you can take bits and pieces of all of these and put them throughout your courses. GE courses provide an opportunity for strong pedagogy. I've already talked about it. If we're pushed out of our groove, if we're asked to be deliberate and rethink what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it and the impact of what we're doing, we're going to be better. This is basic Hawthorne effect. Anytime that we're more deliberate about what we're doing, we're going to be more effective. It's when we fall into that groove that we start to kind of go with the flow and not necessarily be as impactful. Or another way to think about it is we'll be as impactful for our best students, but not as impactful for the rest of them, because the best students can handle this stuff, but we want to make sure that we're attending to everybody in the room. And then I really thought, given the sort of situation of a PNW, I really thought about leaving this one out because I worried that it might worry some people. But as someone who has a writing and rhetoric background as well as the Victorian literature, we know that if you have something where you have dual purposes and dual audiences, it's going to diminish your effectiveness most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time. I would also posit the idea that because we live in our departments and we're attending to the concerns of the people in our department and thinking, gosh, if I'm teaching Psych 101, I better make sure that they're ready for Psych 200 and Psych 300 and Psych 1000. So generally, I think if you have a double dip course, it's going to benefit the majors, but it might have diminishing returns for the gen ed requirements. These integrative components might be less of a feature. I'm not putting that there to complicate anybody's life. I am putting it there because of this next point that I want to make. It isn't actually that hard to reconfigure Lit 101 for the major, and then a Lit 101 that focuses on the Renaissance or the big problems or any of the other clusters that you're thinking about. At my previous institution, the Psych department did a pretty easy survey. Students coming into Psych 101, are you here for Psych or are you here for Gen Ed? Well, 40% were there for Gen Ed, 60% were for Psych. So they said, okay, 60% of our courses are going to be traditional Psych 101. 40 of them are going to be Gen Ed Psych 101. And we're going to make, doesn't take that much of a difference. We do a little bit of tinkering over here and it can be more effective. Interesting coda, about 5-6 years later, they came to the rest of the faculty and they said, our Gen Ed Psych 101 works better than our traditional Psych 101, so we want to have our Gen Ed Psych 101 now count for the traditional Psych 101. So interesting to think about, and a little bit of me sort of asking you to think about solutions that actually aren't that complicated. So anyhow, I've talked for too long. I really do apologize for that. Be very happy to open it up now to questions, thoughts, ideas. And I think it'd probably be okay I'm going to stop sharing because it's probably nicer to see people's faces.
Thank you, Paul. I want to open it up for questions or comments. Again, please feel free to use the raise hand feature. But if I don't see you, you can also just unmute yourself and say, I have a question.
I have a question.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you very much. This is great. I am a historian and I'm the chair of history and philosophy. I was wondering if you could speak to bringing, we've done some team teaching, for example, and usually, at least what I've seen, it's within the college. It'll be like somebody from political science and communication or something like that. Can you speak to bringing expertise from different colleges, say the sciences and history?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea, I'm going to talk about different models for that in just a moment. But part of the reason I think it's a great idea, think about, you know, literature students and their view of the world, or history students and their view of the world. And then think about having an engineer come in and go, here's a complicated problem. Here's what we're facing. How could you help us? Or how would your thinking help us? You know, so to get them to think about not just this wonderful, very powerful educationally abstract realm that we live in, but some of the realities and how to translate. But I also think the reverse works, that it's interesting to walk into an engineering class and say, here's a complex, abstract, ethical question. What are you going to do? You know, one of the wicked problems that I talk about is when the People's Republic of China built a railway going from Beijing to Tibet. For engineers, that was a fascinating problem because it's these wide open expanses. And how do you build with tundra sometimes, with extreme weather conditions, and how do you build a railroad where the materials can withstand the conditions and it's easy enough to repair the materials when things fall apart? You need a plan for all of that, you know, this dynamic situation. But there's a reason that the Chinese were building a railroad from Beijing to Tibet. And there's an ethical question there, and there's a cultural question there, and there's a religious question there, and there's a political question there. And so if we're not bringing that into the conversation, if we're not forcing everybody in every field to think about that, you know, we might end up exactly where we are right now in our country. I don't know, you know, it's just, I mean, oh, and let me talk about models too. Oftentimes when we think about team teaching, we think about two bodies in the room at the same time. That is one model. I will just point out that team teaching can operate in a lot of different ways. You can have the Tuesday lecture where you have 5 professors from 5 different fields rotating through the lecture. And then on Thursday, each of those 5 professors meets with their own group. You can have the model where 2 professors develop, or 3 professors develop a syllabus together, and they never enter each other's classrooms. But because there's that structure that's built collaboratively, they're able to bring ideas into each other's classrooms. And of course, a learning community is a mode of team teaching as well. If I'm teaching a class on artistic and literary responses to science and technology, my colleague Chris is teaching a class on the psychology of social media, and my colleague Gabe is teaching a course on sociology and technology. The same 25 students can go from class to class to class. I can build things into my discussion or things into my assignments that ask them to pull material and ideas and thinking and discussions from each class, and that's collaborative as well. So there's a variety of different models. And I mention that because oftentimes administrators freak out when they think we're going to teach it. So.
I know I want to envision different models. As a department chair, I'm thinking, okay, logistically, how are we going to schedule this? So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things that's happened with the move to virtual, is suddenly it's easier for people to visit each other's classes. And so we've got more faculty having guest lecturers coming in because you can just flip on a computer screen and there you are, kind of thing. So.
Is there another question or comment? Somebody I thought someone had their hand up. Harvey.
I just wanted to make a comment about what we were saying right now, because I tried some of these collaborative ideas before. Let's say I do solid waste management, just as an example, when there's an issue of environmental racism, okay, something like that, where they were going to build an incinerator in Robbins, which is a very poor neighborhood, maybe the poorest in the whole area here. And I wanted to do it basically and have people go out, and you can go to the psychology department or sociology and talk about what besides the technical aspects of it, what do people think? What are their opinions? And then maybe have the communications people do a a video of it and stuff like that. And when I proposed it, this is a number of years ago. I mean, it's not recent. It really got shot down. People were saying, well, we can't put that into our curriculum. There's no room for it, et cetera. The only thing that I see as a possibility right now, without changing anything, is to do it in the honors program. Because I think that would work maybe more easily because we have people from different areas. And if you propose something like that, you will get a mix of students from different places. You just won't have the engineers with the engineers, or the history, as Kathy is saying, you know, talking among themselves. I was trying to do that, but it didn't fly. That was just one comment. And it's something that it's the culture we have that we'd have to change to make that more of a possibility. The other thing I was going to ask you about is, you talk about, even if in collaborative work, I'm just getting back to lab now. Okay, labs where people are working together and it's part of a learning community as well. But I've always found, and I was taught this a long time ago, that the optimum amount of students in a group like that is 3. Okay, really, because if you want them, because I make them write lab reports that are, this is based on my industrial experience. I'm coming in from a writing perspective from that standpoint. And, you know, we're being pushed now to have 4 or 5 more people in groups just from a standpoint of the budget issues that we have. And you know very well, I think everybody knows that runs these classes, you have 5 people, 6 people doing this. You have people standing around watching, not participating actively in that activity. And I don't know if you've come across this in other places or not. That's one question I'll ask you. I have another question for you is, our community of students comes from, I know we talk about traditional ages and all that, but we have all kinds of ages with all kinds of backgrounds and a lot of work experience, a lot of work experience, which I try to bring into class when I give a topic, go to the people that I know are working and say, well, how does this apply on what you're doing, and trying to get them to, just like you were talking about on the jobs, bring that into the classroom so the younger students understand how it really applies in their life to come, they'll be coming forth. So I'll leave that with that and just ask you for your opinions about what I just said.
That's all great, Harvey, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I mean, an interesting thing for the middle scenario that you described, where you asked the question, part of the response I would give is what you're doing in the third scenario. So what you're doing is you're leveraging the situation where you have non-traditional students with traditional students, and you're leveraging, I apologize for the word leveraging. That's such a business word or whatever. That seems to imply transaction and profit. But anyhow, you're using the situation that you have, and you're making something better because of that situation, because of the complexity of the situation. So you're having these non-traditional students, and you're benefiting the traditional students because of their presence in the room. I would say the scenario you're pointing out with the group dynamic, you can do the same thing. The groups are larger than you want them to be, which leads to situations where you've got some people doing more work and some people doing less work. I would use that as a moment for deliberation, for deliberate conversations about collaboration, about participation. One of the interesting things about that dynamic is the complaint we always hear with group work is, well, I'm going to be doing all the work and everybody's going to be slacking off. I don't think there's a lot of evidence to show that that actually happens. There is a lot of evidence to show that the top performing student in the group takes over and tells everybody else what to do. So are your people standing around because they don't care and they don't want to work and they're lazy? Or are they standing around because this person over here is not letting them participate? Here's where I'm going with this. This whole moment of collaboration, it is a complex problem. So is there room in the class for discussion, but also perhaps even in the kinds of questions you ask on quizzes, or the kinds of check-ins you give, or maybe you have students give you a weekly report on how the group project is going, where you say things like, well, does leadership mean speaking and expecting people to follow, or does leadership mean listening? Does leadership mean you're the only person who counts, or does leadership making sure that everybody in the room counts? You know, and those are very loaded questions that I'm asking, so I would hope you wouldn't ask them quite like that. But still, if we're going to have this collaborative situation, can we, that's a less than ideal collaborative situation, can we talk about that so that then when students have another experience in a class where it's not talked about, they have some awareness of what's going on. They have that meta awareness. They're not just doing, but they're thinking about it and reflecting about what they're doing.
No, I mean, you know, if I have a report from a lab, let's say, and they have to write it together, I make them write down who's writing which section, so I know what's going on.
Yeah,
and
but I would also,
we'll have that discussion. Excuse me.
And I would also ask them to answer questions like, well, what worked in doing this and what didn't work? What would you do differently next time? And my guess is you probably ask some of those questions anyhow. One point I want to make about your first point, and I get that you were describing a dynamic that was unfortunate that you didn't necessarily approve of, but it is interesting, right? We have these honors programs that have all these bells and whistles and best practices for the best students who are already in a pretty powerful position in terms of their educational experience. We need to find ways to get those bells and whistles into the common, you know, the education for the other 95% of our students, because they're the ones who it's going to really benefit. That's inclusion, right? I mean, I get why we have honors programs. It draws better students, but finally our goal is to lift every student into higher, more powerful learning. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to be as a lecture, because I get that what you were saying about it as well.
So we have some other hands raised. Jennifer Keon has a question, and then Paul Hecht also has one. Sir?
Thank you. I'll go if you don't mind, Paul. One of the things I'd like to ask is experiences that you might have with faculty. So one of the things we know is that specialization is important as a faculty member, but from the sense of an organization and from the sense of what you presented to us, specialization can be problematic if, in my field, we talk about specialization, people having a means-ends inversion. So what they do as their specialization becomes more important than anything else, and obviously we couldn't function without their specialization. And I think this really lends to both what Kathy and Harvey asked. You know, have you had experiences with faculty to get them to listen and understand there are other parts of the world that may be more important than theirs, maybe at least at one point in time? So your point about having something disruptive happen, you know, maybe your field has to take a second seat toward something else that may be more important.
What's your field, Tom?
Management in the business college.
That's just a great question. I've had experience with that on every single damn campus I've ever visited. So I mean, you know, let's say a couple things. One, grad school doesn't prepare us for general education. It prepares us on an R1 model that says the narrower your expertise, the better you are. Point two, I think, in terms of thinking about how to work with faculty, and that includes me. I went to a small liberal arts college, and then my only jobs after grad school were at small liberal arts colleges, and in between I was at Ohio State University, where they were making me an R1 researcher. You know, it just and I was able to do that, but it sure didn't. It didn't feel good. Yeah, there's a couple ways to sort of think about that and approach faculty. I mean, one is to just point it out to faculty that our lives, we are the weird. You know, we are the 1%, the 2% who are so into our fields and dealing with abstract problems and engaged with that we pay more money to go to more school, and that's just not normal. We're not normal, right? And to just point that out, that most students aren't like us. So that preparing our students as though, and this is kind of what I was talking about with my own experience in teaching Victorian literature. So teaching a class as though everyone in my class is going to get a PhD in Victorian literature just doesn't make any sense. You know, we have different goals. So that's the first thing. And it is interesting because I've never had faculty get mad at me for pointing that out. I've always had faculty laugh because they just are like, oh yeah, God, you're right. you know, and then we do 7 years of graduate school for crap pay, I mean, what are we thinking? The other thing I think would be to ask them to think about ways in which their field already connects to other fields and to life after college. So one of the questions when I'm thinking about, when I'm having faculty do course design, particularly in general education, is how are majors going to use this in the field? How might majors use this not in the field? How might non-majors use this not in the field? And to think about, I mean, finally, we want our courses in gen ed curriculum for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes we have, I guess you all have a model where the more butts and seats, the more money you get. I'm not crazy about that model, but I understand why it happens. But more, I think we want our gen ed our courses in the gen ed curriculum because we think our courses really matter. That what we're doing, the way we're thinking about the world really matters and has an impact. So sometimes it's just a matter of asking faculty to really articulate that. And once they've articulated, say, okay, now what do you have to, are there things you do in your course that are going to get non-majors there? And are there other things you could do in your course to get non-majors there? I guess what I'm saying is in some ways tap into their idealism. Why does your field matter? Why did you, instead of becoming an engineer, become an engineering professor? Why did you, rather than, going off and writing the great American novel, become an English professor? Well, that doesn't, the clear answer for that one, but, does that help, Tom?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Paul. Paul Hecht, you had a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's an inspiring presentation. I'm an English professor. I think there is actually a fairly easy answer, though, to why people spend a bunch of years in grad school to at low pay. It's to get a high status job that is incredibly stable under the most difficult, right? I mean,
and the pay. Don't forget the pay.
So. I mean, at least it used to be, right? Until it was closed in certain fields, as it certainly seems now. But no, I'm interested in how to turn the faculty into a responsive, cohesive, growing group that's serving students in a yeah. But I wanted to ask you a question. So we have a number of senior administrators here, so I want to push back in their direction. What do you see as some of the moves that senior administration can make, or positions or approaches that they can take to providing the best possible launching pad for moving in the kinds of directions you're talking about? I mean, are there some common things that you've seen? I mean, this sort of top-down or grassroots approach, but like what can administrators do to nurture this? If it nurturing's the right verb, maybe it's some other verb,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I would point to a couple things. One, they need to start making it. I would encourage administrators to make it more and a more prominent part of the narrative of the institution, so that and in thoughtful ways, talk about preparing students to encounter problems they've never seen before. Talk about preparing students not just for the first job, but their dream job, talk about and make that part of the narrative. And two, then start to implement that narrative in the structures of the institution. What, for instance, in terms of tenure and promotion, how is working in general education, working in integrative ways, working in pedagogically innovative ways, how is that rewarded, and how is it inscribed into the expectations for tenure and promotion? Sometimes, I mean, I would like to see explicit language. I'm again at small liberal arts colleges. I think there should be explicit language in the tenure and promotion guidelines that talks about general education. Yes, we're hiring you to be a brilliant chemist, but we also want you to be able to take that brilliance and explain it to a student who, if you can flip the switch, is going to be so engaged in chemistry in ways that they've never been before. And I also think, so thinking about that, tenure and promotion, but also thinking about it in terms of, other reward systems. How many of your courses are being taught by sort of adjunct faculty and how many by faculty who have a tenure? And, is there some way to change that dynamic if a lot of it is being, I'm going to use the word outsourced, to show institutional commitment to liberal education, general education? And then another component is, oh, please, come on. It just left me. Okay, I talked about, committee. Curricular proposals for general education, and I don't know what structures you have right now, and so you might already have this, but at one institution that I've worked with, they the initial thing was that every gen ed course went through the curriculum committee, and so the goals of the gen ed curriculum weren't really necessarily honored or held up in the vetting of those proposals. So then they developed a general education group which vetted the proposals before it went to the curriculum committee, but the curriculum committee still had all the power. Then they realized how that dynamic wasn't working. So then they made the gen ed group a gen ed committee. All gen ed course proposals went through the gen ed committee. All other proposals went through the curriculum committee. And in a case where there is double dipping, then it had to go through both. And it could be approved by the curriculum committee and not be approved by the gen ed committee. So it's a way of saying the values of general education count in our narrative, in our reward system, but also in the implementation.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You bet.
So we have time for one more question. We're a little bit over. So Paul, is that okay? One more
That's
question?
fine, perfectly fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I miss these conversations. I haven't been able to have any since June. So.
Well, as I said, when you're on your way to visit your parents, feel free to come by.
Yeah.
Is there another question? Lisa.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on sending your son to a very fine college.
Oh.
My alma mater. Which brings me to the actual question or comment I guess I have. I'm the Dean of the College of Nursing, and in not the only professional program, obviously, Harvey's an engineer. So we struggle with the balance of what I personally would wish for a rich liberal education for our students, and then getting them out in 120 credits and satisfying the various paternities that we have to satisfy with accreditation. Do you have any words of wisdom for how I know we have a solution in our current plan that allows us to meet all these different demands, but for me, it's actually somewhat unsatisfying because it's really not going to change a lot for our curriculum as it stands.
Thank you for asking that. I think that's such a good question, and it came up in an earlier meting I had with the committee this morning. Cheryl, I can't remember her last.
She's one of my directors. Yeah.
And I know she was on this call, or at she'll be. And if I understand it right, the state of Indiana, and that conversation was so interesting that in the 10-minute break, I went downstairs and I said to my wife, guess what? And we talked about it too. So as I understand it, the state of Indiana requires everyone to graduate with 120 credits. And the state nursing association has an expectation of 112 credits. Is that correct? Something like that?
No, they don't set that, but they set the content areas. They do leave you a leeway in terms of integrated versus specific courses, that sort of thing.
Could you do me a favor, Lisa? I would love to see those requirements.
Sure.
I would really love to see them. If you could send them to me or send them to Elaine and she could send them to me, I would appreciate that. Okay, so that was me probing just purely out of curiosity. What we spoke about a little bit is I think I would go back to that Castleton model that I showed you. So yeah, there's not a lot of wiggle room for your own requirements or for exploratory courses. So what I would look at is something that has a high impact additive with a minimal impact in terms of credit expectations. And so an e-portfolio, for instance, might be a really good way to do that, where you're creating a space, and maybe it's like 1 credit added on to 3 courses, 1 in the first year, 1 in the sophomore year, 1 in the senior year, but they're adding on and doing this integrative work there. Or maybe it's a series of assignments that are embedded into 5 or 8 of the nursing courses, where you're asking them, the question is something as simple as, you're studying to be a nurse right now, but we understand that the world's a big and complex place and you might go in any number of directions after you leave. How could you see this as valuable to your life beyond nursing, or something like that? So asking them to make those intellectual reflective moments and sort of building that into courses, into curriculum. In thinking about e-portfolios, and I mentioned this to Cheryl, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and I use it in my writing all the time. Randy Bass, who's at Georgetown University, he was talking about e-portfolios once, and he was talking about a community college who implemented e-portfolios into their program. And he said, and therein lies the construction of the identity of a nurse. And that idea that it's not just the courses we take, it's how we build those courses into our sense of who we are and what we value and what we want to do and how we do it. And we know that reflective component not only deepens our sense of who we are, but it also deepens our understanding of the material. And of course, I think that line, therein lies the construction of a nurse, also means therein lies the construction of a historian, therein lies the construction of a philosopher, therein lies the construction of a waste management architect, or engineer. I mean, it's appropriate for every field to think about it that way. Where do we put the pieces together that make sense out of this fast-paced, sometimes sporadic, some very varied, high-stakes education that we're experiencing right now? How can we put them together? How can we make sense? And recognizing that act, again, deepens the learning. It's not just a soft, feely, touchy thing. When you're revisiting information and ideas and sort of putting them together and figuring out what matters, you're moving from novice to expert.
Yep, thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question. It's so important. And you said you touched on it very lightly. It isn't necessarily what you would like to do. I feel that frustration. Which is why I'm kind of curious to hear what it is that is being required.
Yeah, I'm happy to send that to you. It's quite a lot different than how I grew up.
Okay.
As I started at Grinnell, I have a Grinnell degree. It was a 3-2, so way beyond 120 credit hours, but it was a really rich way to become a nurse.
Yeah, Luther had that same model. They worked with the Mayo Clinic up in Rochester. Yeah, and the interesting thing about
all the ACMs were, I finished up at Rush with the BSM, but I got my BA as well. So that was the other thing. I really wanted that liberal arts degree first. But Luther was one of the other ACMs that joined up.
Well, and the very interesting thing about Grinnell is that finally my son, the son of a guy who just does general education, went to a place that has an open gen ed curriculum, no requirements other than a first-year seminar.
It's still the way? I wondered if it still was the way.
It is still that way, but I'll tell you what, it's the advising.
Yes.
The advising. So my son, physics major, he'd known it from his sophomore year in high school. That's what he wanted to do. He had a philosophy course and a psychology course his first semester. He had a linguistics course his second semester. He took German his third semester. So it can be done, but of course at a place like Grinnell, they can do high touch very easily. So yeah, great school. I'm so impressed with it, I have to say.
Good. Glad you're happy.
Yeah, well, right now Unfortunately for him, right now he's living in my attic, so he's not having the experience he wanted to have. But you know,
Yeah. None of us are really having the
I
experience.
know. Yes.
Well, Paul,
Hopefully-
thank you so much. I'll put you in touch with Lisa too, just to introduce you remotely. But thank you everybody too for joining us today. And again, thank you, Paul, so much for spending a couple of hours virtually with P&W today.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for the questions and the ideas and the challenges and the enthusiasm, and for the work that you're doing at your institution. Thank you.
Thank you. So have a great afternoon, everybody, and a wonderful weekend, and happy Halloween.